Welcome to this webinar, School Year 2022 to 2023 Pandemic EBT Guidance, hosted by the Food Research and Action Center, or FRAC. I'm Steve Hayward, FRAC's Senior Communications Coordinator. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few brief housekeeping items. We expect this webinar to run about 30 to 45 minutes. We're recording the presentation and we'll send the recording and slides in a follow-up email. At the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom right of the WebEx screen. With that, I'll pass it off to Crystal Fitzsimons, Director of School and Out-of-School Time Programs at FRAC.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited to have this conversation about the new Pandemic EBT guidance for the upcoming school year. Next slide. And I think most people who are on the webinar are familiar with Pandemic EBT, but just to level set a little bit, Pandemic EBT provides an EBT card to families that they can use to purchase food at retailers that participate in SNAP. And Pandemic EBT was designed to replace the school breakfasts and lunches and snacks that kids received when school is in session, and it was designed to respond to the pandemic when millions of kids lost access to free and reduced price school meals when the pandemic hit. Next slide. So the Pandemic EBT has only been with us for about 2.5 years, which is a little hard to believe given how much work we've all done to support the program and make sure that families who are eligible receive those benefits. But it was created back in the spring of 2020, and it was created really quickly, modeled after the summer EBT program, which had been incredibly successful and shown to reduce food insecurity and improve nutrition when kids lost access to school meals. So Pandemic EBT was created and moved forward when schools closed in the spring in response to the pandemic. And then over time, it's really expanded to ensure that it meets the needs of families who have lost access to school meals due to the pandemic. So in October 2020, the program was extended and expanded to provide benefits so that kids who were attending school in hybrid models or fully virtual models would be able to access benefits. It expanded to allow young children to receive benefits, young children whose households participated in SNAP to replace lost childcare meals. And then summer benefits were added in 2021. That was the first year that families were able to receive Pandemic EBT benefits during the summer. And these benefits remain available during the public health emergency. So USDA is going to talk a bit about how this program is going to operate this school year. And then assuming Congress doesn't change anything, the summer benefits are available the summer after the public health emergency ends. So even if the public health emergency ends this year, during the school year, summer benefits would still be available and states would be able to provide them. Next slide. So, as with many other programs during the pandemic, there was a tremendous amount of work and effort that happened in order to make sure that the program got up and running and that the families who needed benefits were able to receive them, ranging from USDA and all the hard work that they've done to implement the program, state agencies across the country, both SNAP agencies and child nutrition agencies, as well as advocates and nonprofit sponsors who have worked to ensure that the program is a success. And I really think it's important to kind of take a step back and think about how impactful this program has been for families. We've collected quotes from hundreds of families. I just wanted to lift up a couple. I was struggling not knowing when our next meal would be. When they did notify me about summer Pandemic EBT, I called to make sure I wasn't dreaming. I cried on the phone to the operator. Thank you so much for your gift. My family has been so blessed. Thank you. I have 2 high school students, and it's very hard when we lost the meals, having to look to find another source or way for them to eat. It's a parent's worst nightmare. I'm glad someone's finally looking out for us. So those are 2 quotes that I wanted to lift up as we think about implementing for this school year, which also obviously allows people to provide benefits over the summer as well. Next slide. And there's another quote from a parent who saw the benefits of Pandemic EBT, but I just wanted to give people a sense of the scope of Pandemic EBT. So during the 2 fiscal years that we have full data for, fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021, the Pandemic EBT program provided over $39 billion worth of nutrition benefits to families across the country. And it really was the difference between having access to the food that the family needed versus having hunger at your doorstep. So wanted to lift that up because I know people are getting ready to start writing their plans for this school year. And I think it's always really good to center how important and how valuable and how impactful the Pandemic EBT program has been. And then I just also, next slide, wanted to just lift up a couple of FRAC resources before I turn it over to USDA to really dig into the guidance for this school year. We recently released a report on recommendations for a permanent nationwide summer EBT program. We are very hopeful that Congress will take a look at how impactful Pandemic EBT has been for families and create a nationwide summer EBT program. So it's got recommendations on the best way to do that, including having state fact sheets for how they implemented it. And then we have a lot of resources about Pandemic EBT up on our website. So just wanted to lift those resources up to people before I actually pass it over to Wes with USDA to really dig into the guidance.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I really appreciate you setting us up and setting up the conversation, thinking about all the wonderful things that Pandemic EBT has been able to accomplish. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we discuss the guidance for Pandemic EBT for school year 22-23. My name is Wes Gaddy, and I'll be covering the presentation portion of today's webinar. We appreciate you taking the time to join us and want to extend our thanks for all of the work done by advocates in previous years of P-EBT. We know in some cases households have been slow to use their benefits, and we really appreciate your diligent work promoting awareness of P-EBT and your partnership with states to help get messaging out there. Could we go to the next slide, please? So I also want to talk a little bit about the numbers and want to just talk a little bit about sort of the success of P-EBT in the past. So before we talk about school year 22-23, let's just spend a moment sort of looking at where we've been. During school year 21-22, USDA approved 35 school plans and 45 child care plans. The states estimated would issue $5.9 billion in benefits to 15.1 million children. USDA also approved 46 plans covering summer 2022, estimated to provide 3.27 million children with around $12.8 billion in benefits. As Crystal shared a number earlier, looking at 2020 and 2021, we have a little bit more recent data that we wanted to share. From the late spring of 2020 through midsummer 2022, states have issued $52 billion in total issuances for P-EBT. It's truly amazing what states have been able to accomplish, and we're grateful for the work that everyone has been doing to make P-EBT a reality for the families who need it. We appreciate everyone's work to make P-EBT possible. Next slide, please. Since the public health emergency for COVID-19 has continued into school year 22-23, P-EBT for school children and children in child care remains an option for states to administer. Like last year, we expect that most children will be learning in person and will have access to free or reduced price meals at their school. However, as states know from last year, many children will have isolated incidents where they may miss meals due to COVID. The P-EBT requirements and simplifying assumptions available during school year 22-23 will generally be the same as the ones that were offered during school year 21-22, with a few notable exceptions that we'll discuss over the course of the webinar. Our hope is that states will be able to use last year's plan as a starting place, and they will not need to start from scratch as we've had to in previous years when conditions change drastically between school years. And as a reminder, states must submit new plans for USDA's review and approval prior to issuing benefits, and only states with an approved plan for either school children or children in child care for school year 22-23 will be able to operate summer P-EBT. Next slide, please. The first thing I want to discuss from the guidance is the potential end of the public health emergency and its impact on P-EBT. We received this question a lot and have addressed the issue on previous webinars, but we wanted to make sure that we had a Q&A covering the issue so everyone's clear. Once the public health emergency ends, children will not be eligible to receive P-EBT for any additional days of the school year. However, states can continue to submit plans after the end of the public health emergency, covering the time period from the beginning of the school year to the end of the public health emergency. And we'll also talk about summer as well, but as Crystal mentioned, if you have a school year plan and the public health emergency ends, summer P-EBT still continues until the summer following a school year where there was a P-EBT offered. Next slide, please. The next change I want to discuss is for the income eligibility requirements. In previous years, when schools were not uniformly collecting free and reduced price meal applications, states were permitted to use the most current eligibility status, even if it was from a previous school year. And now that schools have returned to standard counting and claiming and are collecting applications, states must use the data from the current school year. This also means that the effective date of eligibility will follow the standard NSLP rules, meaning schools can use either the date of submission, the date of approval, or the date a child was determined eligible through direct certification as the effective date of eligibility. P-EBT benefits cannot be assumed back to the beginning of the school year, now that schools have returned to collecting applications. Next slide, please. Last year, most states identified the days that children were eligible for P-EBT using a combination of data sets, including lists of students approved for full-time virtual learning, the actual number of COVID-related absences from schools that were able to provide that data, blocks of 5 or more consecutive excused absences, and parent-initiated applications for absences of 4 or less days. And in many states, identifying these data sets and working out this process took some effort last year. And the good news is that this year, states don't need to develop a new process to identify P-EBT eligible days and calculate benefit amounts. Instead, states can continue to use the process from school year 21-22 plans for identifying the days that children are eligible for benefits. Next slide, please. One assumption that many states used last year was issuing a fixed benefit based on the differences in length of COVID-related absences. A tiered benefit structure may be easier to administer and communicate to families. And some states note that a tiered benefit may reduce administrative costs and present less of a risk to program integrity. At a minimum, a tiered benefit must distinguish very short COVID-related absences from absences of greater length and should use the midpoint of the tier rather than the highest amount when determining benefit levels. And we've included an example on the slides and in the Q&As with an example tier. Next slide, please. The biggest change to the school year 22-23 guidance is the addition of a category of eligible children that were not eligible under previous guidance. In response to concerns that USDA's guidance from school year 21-22 excluded a group of eligible children, starting this year, states will be required to provide a means for children who left their NSLP participating school due to COVID and enrolled in a non-NSLP virtual school or began homeschooling to receive P-EBT benefits. We want to be clear that this is a very narrow eligibility criteria. We are not saying that all virtual school children or all homeschool children are eligible for P-EBT. Only that subset who previously attended an NSLP participating school and left due to COVID. Next slide, please. We understand there may be some challenges to identifying children who are no longer attending NSLP participating schools and confirming that the reason that they left was due to COVID. One option is that states can choose to require all households that have left NSLP participating schools to submit applications, which provide the information needed to confirm children are eligible for benefits, and where parents attest that the reason their child left their NSLP participating school is due to COVID. States can also make the simplifying assumption that any child who left their NSLP participating school from January 2020, the start of the COVID public health emergency, through the end of school year 2020-2021, did so due to COVID because of the significant impact that COVID had during school year 1920 and 2021. States can also make the simplifying assumption that any child who left their NSLP participating school during school year 21-22 or during the current school year 22-23 did so due to COVID if the state finds that it remains reasonable to assume that the reason they've left their school is due to COVID. And as the slides note, we describe this in more detail in the P-EBT Q&As on USDA's website. USDA encourages states to amend previous school year plans to provide benefits to these children, but states are not required to amend their previous plans. However, for this school year, USDA will only approve school plans that include a method for providing benefits to children who have left their NSLP participating school due to COVID. And so I recognize this is a lot of new material, particularly on this section. So I wanted to give a little bit of background about how we got to where we are on this virtual school issue. The legislation authorized P-EBT, which was enacted at the start of the pandemic, permitted states to provide benefits to school children who would have received USDA-funded NSLP meals at school if not for the COVID public health emergency. The legislative text is short, and it's fair to say did not anticipate the changes in schools' responses to COVID over the past 2.5 years. When the legislation was enacted in spring of 2020, almost every school had closed their doors, and the population of eligible children was easy to recognize. When schools began to reopen in the fall of 2020, many schools switched to virtual instructions, but others adopted hybrid schedules. Although the legislation didn't anticipate hybrid schedules, all of us recognized that children with hybrid schedules were eligible for P-EBT on the days that they didn't attend school in person. After a year of school-provided hybrid and virtual instruction, some states and school districts began directing health-compromised children and children with health-compromised family members to non-NSLP participating virtual academies. In some cases, that was the only virtual option offered to those children. Several states, as well as child nutrition advocates, brought this group of children to USDA's attention, and they made a compelling case that these children should be eligible for P-EBT benefits. Although these children are no longer attending an NSLP participating school, they would have received meals at their NSLP participating school if not for COVID, just like they did before the pandemic. After additional review of the legislation, USDA agrees that it can be interpreted to cover the subset of children in fully virtual schools who left their NSLP schools due to concerns about COVID. But under that interpretation, children who left their NSLP schools in favor of homeschooling would also be eligible. As I noted earlier, USDA's revised guidance applies to a relatively narrow subset of children in non-NSLP virtual schools and an equally narrow subset of children in homeschooling. USDA's new guidance extends benefits to children who have very recent ties to their NSLP schools, and all of these children were served by states' child nutrition programs at the outset of the pandemic. We need to be clear in our communication with parents and the general public, whether in USDA's guidance or on state websites or in other materials, that we are not referring to the entire universe of homeschool children or children in virtual schools. Next slide, please. So now to talk a little bit about childcare P-EBT, which luckily has not changed very much. For childcare P-EBT, USDA will approve plans that use last year's childcare methodology. As most of you probably know, USDA encouraged states to look at the number of lunches served by CACFP participating childcare centers and family daycare homes as the basis for issuing P-EBT benefits to childcare children last year. Specifically, USDA encouraged states to calculate the reduction in CACFP reimbursable lunches served in the current school year and compare that to the number in the same months prior to the pandemic. In months where the number of CACFP lunches remains below the pre-pandemic count, children would be eligible for P-EBT childcare benefits. The value of the benefit was based on the size of the reduction in CACFP meal claims. For example, if CACFP lunches in October 2022 were 20% lower than the number served in October 2019, a state would issue a P-EBT benefit to SNAP-enrolled children under age 6 for 20% of the school days in October 2022. We think that the CACFP data approach worked well last year, and we think the states would generally agree since all but one of the 45 approved P-EBT childcare plans for last year used the CACFP data approach. In order to simplify P-EBT this year as much as possible, USDA will encourage states to use the same methodology for this year. States will need to update benefit amounts in their plan based on the current year CACFP claims, but otherwise should only need to make minimal changes to the childcare sections of their plan. States do not have to specify the benefit amounts in plans since the data becomes available throughout the year, as long as the state specifies the process that will be used to determine benefit levels and includes an agreement to confirm the benefit amount with USDA prior to issuance. Next slide, please. Like last year, states can issue summer P-EBT benefits if they have an approved school year plan for either school children or childcare children. P-EBT's authorizing statute treats summer benefits for school children a little differently than summer benefits for the childcare population. States may issue summer 2023 P-EBT benefits to school children as long as the COVID health emergency exists during school year 2022-2023. However, states may only issue summer 2023 P-EBT to their childcare population if the public health emergency continues into the summer months. Since the public health emergency has continued into school year 2022-2023, we can say for certain that summer 2023 P-EBT benefits will be available for school children. At this point, we cannot say whether P-EBT benefits will be available for SNAP-enrolled children under age 6 next summer, since that is dependent on whether the public health emergency continues during the summer. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, a little bit more that I wanted to talk about before we get into questions. So since releasing the updated P-EBT guidance, USDA has hosted 2 webinars for states and have joined calls with states in a few of the FNS regions. And we wanted to just discuss a few of the points that have come out of those conversations. So starting with a little bit about the virtual and homeschool kids, we want to be clear that P-EBT eligibility for virtual and homeschool children requires that they have a free and reduced price status for the specific years that states are proposing to provide benefits. So if a state wants to amend their school year 21-22 plan to include virtual and homeschool children who left their NSLP school, and the state also has a school year 22-23 plan, they would need to establish which children were eligible for free or reduced price meals during school year 21-22 and during school year 22-23. We've been talking with states about the information available in student information systems that could be used to confirm if a child was previously enrolled in an NSLP school and to confirm their eligibility for free and reduced price meals. And so we hope to receive some state plans soon so we can start discussing the appropriate standards for validating the eligibility of the virtual and homeschooled children. I also wanted to share a few common questions that have come up, and some of these I think were also submitted in advance of this webinar. So if a state submits only a child care plan and a summer plan, must the summer plan include provisions for issuance of benefits to children who are enrolled in virtual academies during the school year or who are homeschooled? And the answer to that is yes. summer plans must provide a method for children who were previously enrolled in an NSLP school and have left that school since the start of the pandemic due to concerns about COVID to receive benefits. Next question. Can a state submit a plan that does not include providing benefits to students who attended virtual academies or are homeschooled in order to start getting benefits out sooner if it commits to developing a system before the end of the school year to get benefits to those students? And so the answer to that is that a plan that covers school children must cover the children who left their NSLP schools to attend virtual academies or begin homeschooling due to concerns about COVID. USDA will be working with states as they submit plans for the current school year to ensure that their plans cover all eligible children. And we'll work with states to ensure that they're able to issue benefits as quickly as possible, understanding that they might need to develop some new processes to reach the subset of virtual and homeschool children who are eligible. We've also gotten some questions about how the date of eligibility works for students who have 30-day carryover from a previous school year. And for this, I just want to make clear that, eligibility for P-EBT is based on the NSLP eligibility. USDA addressed how 30-day carryover would work in the NSLP this school year, and P-EBT is following the same rules. So on the days that children are determined eligible for free or reduced price meals, they've met the P-EBT income eligibility requirements. All right, one last question I wanted to cover, and then we can open it up and talk as a group. This question is, in previous years, there have been retroactive eligibility for benefits, which has been critical to getting benefits to families. Is there any flexibility with the effective date of eligibility? And this is something that we addressed in the Q&As. But since school districts have resumed collecting applications to establish eligibility for NSLP benefits during school year 22-23, USDA believes that the submission date of applications is the best feasibly available data for determining the start of a child's eligibility for P-EBT during school year 22-23. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ed Harper from USDA. Ed, if you want to share any words, or we can go right into some questions and answers.
Thanks, Wes. I don't have anything else to add. I know that, since our guidance came out 3 weeks back, the states have been thinking about, how they're going to structure their plans for this year. I think they've probably spoken with you about their concerns. And, hopefully we've answered some of the bigger questions, but like Wes said earlier, the smaller things, the technical matters, are going to be things that we hash out with the states after they submit their plans and propose solutions to some of the challenges that are unique to this year. So I'm looking in the Q&A for questions. There aren't any right now. See, some questions are popping up in the chat.
So there is one question in the chat that's, do all students at CEP schools receive P-EBT benefits?
Well, children in CEP schools meet one of two criteria for P-EBT benefits. They are eligible for free or reduced price meals. So they would receive free or reduced price meals if not for the COVID emergency. The second criterion, though, is that they're not receiving meals at school. So CEP students who miss in-person days due to the COVID emergency this school year will get P-EBT benefits for those days. And that's no change, right, since the start of P-EBT. That's how it's worked since the beginning. I would address Mr. Negus by your first name, but I don't have your first name. But your concern, this is something that Wes mentioned earlier. It was one of the questions that Crystal had sent to us prior to the pandemic. Whether states can submit plans that only cover, the kids who are remaining, currently attending their NSLP school, and omit for the present, with sort of a commitment to cover this group of fully virtual kids and children who left their NSLP schools to begin homeschooling. I think we've talked about this in our national webinar. I think our concern is that we just need to make sure that all the eligible kids are covered by the state's plans. At this point, what we've said to our states is submit a plan that covers all the kids, and then we can work with the state to come up with a solution for that methodology, even if it requires some difference in timing of benefit issuance. We're not committing to anything on this webinar. Obviously, we need to see what the states propose, but we do recognize that this is an issue, and obviously our goal is not to make this something that prevents states from submitting plans.
One thing we saw this year was, there were states that had, a reconsideration process for the children that had 4 or less absences, and many states, had plans that would issue to the children they could identify automatically at a certain point, since they were receiving data that allowed them to issue those benefits without requiring anything from households, and then had a later issuance that was covering, the children who were submitting information through the reconsideration process. So there's precedent for having a different time of issuance and having, we understand that different systems might mean that there's different ability to issue benefits at different times. But all of those plans last year did include the process for how that reconsideration process was going to work. And so I think that we're looking to do something similar to last year, where even if that process was not completely figured out, that we had, at least in the plan, a plan that covered all of the eligible children.
Right, Carol's question, state doesn't track virtual or homeschool children. Well, again, we need to see what the state proposes. We're obviously USDA is committed to working with each state to come up with a solution on how to address that. But we first need to see what the states propose, what they can and they can't do, and what solution would be appropriate for the state given the specific data limitations that they're facing. And Chloe is just asking, do we have a sense of what specific data states can use? Again, unfortunately, I don't know everybody who's asking questions here, so I don't know if you're a state official or if you're not a state official. We've spoken to states about, how they're proposing to identify these kids, and not every state has spoken up yet, right? But some states have suggested that they do have an approach. So we're hoping that some early states get plans in the near term and that they can serve as models for other states. Carol's question is similar to Chloe's. Again, I think we're all anxious to get the first few state plans to see how that state, the first handful of states solve these issues. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Let me see if I can back to the Q&A. No questions there. Steve and Crystal, I refer to you guys on when you want to, what you want to do next.
So I think we can go ahead and close it out then if there's no more questions. Stephen, do you want to wrap up the webinar? Oh, we might have lost Stephen. So I can, oh, there you are, Stephen.
Sorry, I'm here. I'm here. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much for attending this webinar hosted by FRAC, the Food Research and Action Center. We want to thank USDA for their participation and their answers. Check your inbox over the next week for a follow-up email with the slides and the recording. If you have any questions about the presentation, feel free to reach out using the email shayward@frac.org. That's my email. And it's S like Sam, HAYWARD. For more P-EBT resources, visit frac.org. You can find our P-EBT page under the Programs tab, and we'll send out links in the follow-up email. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you.